Welcome, everybody. Good morning or good afternoon to all of you. I am Martin Quencez. I'm the Deputy Director of the Paris office of the German Marshall Fund. I'm very happy to moderate this book talk with Dr. Stephen Wertheim on his new book, Tomorrow the World, the Birth of U.S. Global Supremacy. Dr. Wertheim is a historian of the United States in the world. He is Deputy Director of Research and Policy at the Quencez Institute. He is also a research scholar at the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies at Columbia University. He specializes in US foreign relations and international order from the late 19th century to the present. Welcome, Stephen. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to discuss this book. I believe this is truly original work on US history and foreign policy, and an addition to the current debate on the role of the US in the world. So the format of the discussion is as follows. We have about 45 minutes. We'll have an exchange, you and I first, and then I will take questions from the audience. You can all ask your question through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So please write your question, and I will ask them directly to Stephen in a few minutes. So in this book, you aim to show that US military primacy and global leadership was indeed a choice that was made at a very specific time in US history, and you discuss how the US foreign policy debate was changed at the time to become some sort of a binary position between internationalists and isolationists. You also explain how international organizations such as the UN were designed to help US primacy endure after the Second World War. So to start the discussion, my first question, very simple, is I suggest that you tell us what made you want to write this book and present to us your main arguments.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thanks to everybody for joining on this morning or afternoon or evening, wherever you are. I'm grateful for it. I think I was responding, as many historians do, but maybe sometimes pretend they don't. I was responding to the world around me. 9/11 happened when I was, I think, a senior in my senior year in high school, and I noticed how not only did the U.S. response to the 9/11 attacks, not only was it quite militarized in a way that did not seem obvious, but the debate surrounding America's role in the world struck me as quite narrow. And I wanted to know, both what were the conditions of possibility for the United States to exercise such power on a global scale in my own time, as well as why there seemed to be remarkably little political contestation of great meaning surrounding the projection of US military power over several decades. And so that's how I kind of came to a historical question. Well, when exactly was it, and why was it that the United States made a choice to embark on global primacy in military terms, when we all kind of know that this was not what the founders of the country had in mind when, say, George Washington warned his countrymen against making permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world, in his phrase. We know that that has changed remarkably. And so it turned out that in my research, there seemed to have been a specific moment of rupture when there was genuine uncertainty as to which way the United States would go. And as I looked into the archives further, a whole set of American officials and semi-officials and intellectuals were thinking about the general role the United States should play in international order, and coming to a very decisive conclusion that it should be the dominant power militarily in something like perpetuity, holding itself responsible for enforcing world order.
And if you could elaborate a bit more on this very specific moment during the Second World War. What I found very interesting is that in this kind of official history of the US that we may all know, the kind of turning point is Pearl Harbor. And you, in your book, would rather consider the fall of France being the moment where US policymakers changed their policy and their vision for the US in the world.
That's exactly right. It was actually in the wake of the fall of France to Nazi Germany within the span of just 6 weeks in the middle of 1940 that caused many people around the world to recalculate what they believed about the balance of power going forward, but caused Americans to really change their thinking about America's role. Prior to the fall of France, for most Americans, including people who would come to advocate US military dominance, they saw very little reason for the United States to enter World War II, much less to project military power in a robust way beyond the Western Hemisphere after the war. They expected something like a repeat of World War I with stalemates. And so people got started doing post-war planning in the State Department and in institutions like the Council on Foreign Relations, but they came to very familiar conclusions in line with the American tradition of avoiding extra-hemispheric entanglements, that is to say, political and military commitments in the so-called old world of Europe and Asia. What changed in the wake of the fall of France was that for the first time, Americans faced a specter that totalitarian powers might become the dominant powers in Europe and Asia. And totalitarian powers raised a couple of troubling specters for Americans. Not that the United States would be invaded in North America anytime soon, not that its economic prosperity was fundamentally threatened, since the US economy, particularly after the Great Depression, was not that dependent on foreign trade, but rather that the United States would no longer be able to fulfill its aspiration to lead the world to bigger and better things, to be the engine of world history. Instead, it would have to be on the receiving end of world history defined by the Axis powers. So you might call that concern a concern about that comes from a place of American exceptionalism. And furthermore, that in an Axis-led world, the United States would not enjoy basically liberal terms of intercourse, of trade, of commerce around the world. There could be no meaningful world order to speak of. And so it was not an easy choice for Americans to make what to do about the situation. After all, some Americans decided that because the United States seemed to be territorially secure and its economic prosperity seemed to also to be secure, the United States should embark on a program of defending the entire Western Hemisphere, but not go further. And that was the essential. That was the essentials of the so-called America First position, named after the America First Committee that formed in September of 1940. But most U.S. officials and people surrounding the Roosevelt administration at that time came to a more expansive conclusion that suddenly the balance of power in Eurasia really mattered to the United States. It mattered because of how the United States defined itself, its role in the world, and that given the collapse of France and the weakness of British imperial power at that point, the United States had to step in and play the premier role as a world ordering agent, protecting liberal intercourse by force, which previously they had assumed did not have to be done. What internationalism had meant previously to Americans had largely been an aspiration to transcend power politics through peaceful intercourse. But Hitler's conquest seemed to prove that the opposite was true, that in order to have basically liberal kinds of intercourse, that had to be defended by force.
Another point that you make in the book, and I think it's worth elaborating upon, is that very quickly during the war, the question that was asked was not only about winning the war, but to think about the American primacy and global leadership after the war. Now, how exactly was this discussion going in Washington, D.C.? What were the different options that were considered? And a point that I really want to dig into is how much of what we call today the post-45 international order was already designed in order to help U.S. primacy endure in time?
Yeah, this is something that struck me, and I was surprised by these findings as I looked in documents about post-war planning. So even before the United States had entered the war, before the attack on Pearl Harbor at the end of 1941, American post-war planners didn't know what the outcome of the war would be. They were incredibly concerned about the American public and whether the American public would revert to its non-entanglement tradition, i.e. isolationism. Would the American public accept the notion of shouldering the burdens of military leadership in the post-war world? And so some of the initial plans for American dominance in 1941 had basically taken the status quo that existed geopolitically at that time and imagined that the United States would partner with the British Empire, or more specifically, the British Commonwealth of Nations in the post-war world, and square off in a kind of post-war Cold War against a Europe that was dominated by the Axis powers, or at least occupied in part by the Axis powers. And that position, the planners quickly came to see, especially after it was floated, in a sense, by Roosevelt and Churchill through the Atlantic Charter toward the end of 1941. Post-war planners noticed that there was a lot of resistance to this idea of exclusive American-British leadership. Even future Cold Warriors that we know as, Dwight Eisenhower's Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles. At the time, he decried the Atlantic Charter as a statement of Anglo-Saxon military and economic hegemony. And so, again, already starting before Pearl Harbor and then continuing into 1942 and beyond, American elites were trying to think of ways to create a bulwark of legitimacy in favor of the post-war projection of American power. That the United States public supported the war effort was very clear after Pearl Harbor. There was very little dissent against it. But the post-war seemed to be another matter, according to American officials. And that is the fundamental explanation, I think, for why American planners, starting in 1942, decided that the United States should seek to create a new world organization to be the successor of the League of Nations. Now, they had just been rejecting the League of Nations as a naive fantasy in which public opinion was somehow supposed to keep international order. That looked like a dangerous illusion through the 1930s, and especially after the fall of France. But nevertheless, they then came to plan the United Nations. Initially, they didn't even really know what the United Nations would consist of, but they thought it was very important to have some kind of vehicle that might demonstrate, not just to other powers, but also, and especially to the American public, that the United States would lead the world in a different, more enlightened kind of way, based on something like rules, common participation, and so forth. And so what I ended up tracing through the war years, 1942 to 1945, for the United States, were not the specific plans for the reconstruction of Germany and Japan, let's say, that other historians have looked at, but rather the set of actors who were very concerned about the post-war world and carried out what I see as a campaign nominally around making sure the United States joined the United Nations, but really about trying to create a bulwark of legitimacy in the American public for the post-war exercise of American power. And the way they did that was to frame the choice in terms of internationalism on the one hand and isolationism on the other. Isolationism being a relatively new term at that time that had come into widespread usage only in the 1930s and came to be used more and more across the war years, even as actual people who opposed the U.S. use of force dwindled in number. But it was against this specter of isolationism that armed dominance for the United States could come to look like the epitome of internationalism, and thus it would seem as though transcending power politics, the old aspiration of internationalism, was the same thing as dominating power politics for the United States. So I argue that U.S. global dominance was essentially legitimated, argued for, based on this contradiction, that transcending power politics and dominating it pointed to the same recipe, U.S. military dominance. And I think that's the same kind of conceptual underpinning that is employed to this day.
Now, you mentioned the League of Nations. Another piece of kind of official history is that this idea of U.S. leadership was very much built on the lessons learned of the First World War and of the years between the two world wars. Now, how much of this truly played in what you describe as this kind of organized choice for dominance? How much of the failures of U.S. foreign policy in the 20s and in the 30s influenced the decisions in the 40s and afterwards?
Essentially, all thinking about the role the United States should play after World War II was refracted through exactly what you described, through a sense that whatever the United States had done in the First World War and afterwards had been a failure, and something different had to take place. The issue, though, is that it wasn't clear. It was very much debated exactly what had gone wrong and thus what needed to change. So those who favored the U.S. Keeping out of a looming war in Europe, they learned a lesson from World War I that the United States should pursue a deeper kind of neutrality than before and restrict certain kinds of trading and financial relationships with countries who were at war, so that the United States wouldn't be dragged into that war, because their lesson was that was a terribly destructive war that served no U.S. national interest. And so that was a powerful position. And indeed, there are people who disagreed with that and were searching for ways for the United States to collaborate with the League of Nations or the major powers in Europe to try to put U.S. power on the side of the democracies. But they, too, didn't really have a great solution before the fall of France, and certainly weren't willing to advocate, open U.S. military intervention in a looming conflict until very late. So what's constant throughout the period from 1930 to 1945 is the sense that things had gone wrong previously, and the United States had to make new choices. But the lessons drawn from the World War I experience changed rapidly in real time in response to surprising events like the fall of France.
Perhaps my last question on the more historical part of the book, and then I would very much like to hear you more about the implications for today's U.S. foreign policy. But in the book, you argue that what happened during those years of the 40s kind of constitute a breaking point in U.S. history. That before that, U.S. foreign policy act upon different principles, and that this should be seen as truly the birth of U.S. global domination. But you also mentioned that all throughout the 90s and early 20th century, the U.S. had already pursued some sort of domination over the whole Western Hemisphere. So the question is, to what extent is it not just a difference in degree, in just expanding the geographical scope of this domination rather than a difference in nature? And perhaps without taking any kind of deterministic view here, whether it's simply the expansion of US interests across the globe as the US become much more powerful, that explains that decision.
So I think you can fairly describe the basic record of the United States as having been dramatically expansionist from the time it was 13 colonies forward. I think that's a fair way to narrate U.S. history, and many people do that. I just think that that obscures something that ought to qualify as a difference in kind, not just of degree. There was a tradition for all of U.S. history, still most of U.S. history, until 1940, that whatever the United States did, it would do in the name of avoiding entanglements in the old world, out of a recognition that what happened there did not fundamentally impinge on the United States, its interests, what it was as a political project, and so forth. So even attempts previously to involve the United States in World War I, a European war, or the League of Nations had involved a suggestion, as Woodrow Wilson himself put it, that the League of Nations was really a disentangling alliance that would be animated above all by the force, not of the military, but of public opinion. And one looks at vain through this period for serious planning about how the United States was going to routinely project armed force in Europe and across Eurasia. So that's why, right? Maybe, you know, some larger interests or ideology or capitalism or something was behind the scenes pushing the United States outward. But that's why many serious people, as of the middle of the 1930s, as of the beginning of World War II, thought it was really implausible that the United States would go on to play the role that it played and that it told itself it obviously had to play. So I think we had to take, you know, in some way we have to account for that serious appraisal of things in which, you know, as of the beginning of 1940, despite the U.S. acquiring colonies and mastery over the Western Hemisphere, it had a very plausible option for itself to confine itself to a Western Hemispheric definition of its vital interest, that is to say, what it would go to war to defend. And in fact, even a lot of people were willing to jettison the U.S. colony in the Philippines at that point, which was already on a trajectory toward independence.
I want to turn to the chat and please ask your question also through the Q&A function if you can. First question on whether you could discuss the importance of Franklin Roosevelt and his personality in the rise of U.S. dominance, and the follow-up question is, did his strong opposition to European empires, and especially the French one, played a significant role in shaping U.S. post-war internationalist foreign policy?
That's an excellent question. My approach in this study was the opposite. Essentially, there's a lot of diplomatic history trying to read the tea leaves of what FDR really believed and what he did. And I think that that's good work. To me, what's really important, though, isn't just what FDR says and does, but what people who had much more time and would go on to be the people who implemented U.S. global leadership after 1945, what they were thinking and planning. Just a rung or two beneath the President of the United States. FDR, though, does basically conform with the narrative that I tell as a general matter about American foreign policy elites. I mentioned that when he issues the Atlantic Charter, he actually opposes Winston Churchill's suggestion that the Atlantic Charter include an endorsement of an effective international organization. FDR strikes that from the record because he believes at that point, in line with other post-war planners, that only America and Britain are capable of keeping the peace in the post-war world. He then comes to be convinced of the United Nations in 1943 because his man in the State Department, Sumner Welles, sits down with him. Welles had been leading the post-war planning group in thinking about the post-war order. Wells convinces him that FDR need not fear that the UN will become a new League of Nations, just an empty debating society that will stifle effective action. In fact, to the contrary, it will help the United States project its power. It will make it appear more legitimate, and it will even provide mechanisms for the United States. And this gets back to the other half of the question, to have oversight into what European colonial empires are doing so that the United States can pursue the open door. With respect to just a little bit more on the question of colonial empire, I don't think that FDR or many people around him were opposed to colonial empire as such. I think that they basically pursued the vision of the open door that dated back to the beginning of the 20th century. They certainly, just as other colonial powers opposed the colonial power of their colonial rivals, that was basically the position of the United States. The United States wanted equal access to raw materials, to economic exchange in the colonies, and that was a priority for the administration and part of the trusteeship system that was set up through the UN. But decolonization as we know it was still a quite far-fetched scenario, that is to say, complete decolonization of the world in a rapid amount of time, a few decades, was not something that was anticipated. And FDR and other planners anticipated colonial empire going on for much, much longer than it did.
And as I said at the very beginning, it is obviously a work of history, but as I read it, it rang a lot of bells on what's happening today in the US and in the US foreign policy debate. There is a question in the chat that will give us a great segue to maybe talk a bit more about present time. So what lessons of the World War II period and the immediate post-war environment are applicable to today's global environment? In a way, to what extent what you tell us here on the war period and the direct aftermath is still relevant to understand US foreign policy today?
Let me say some things I think are relevant and some things that are not relevant. Even though I am critical of the very ambitious plans for US military dominance that were developed by American officials and intellectuals very early in World War II. I admire them. I admire the way the United States was able to take a long-term view of things. I admire the way they reacted to events in a creative fashion and forged something that I think was genuinely new. And I think they appreciated that what they were doing was a departure from what had come before. And even though I think, calling one side isolationists unfairly and another side internationalists has distorted US foreign policy debate ever since, at least there was a significant appreciation that in a democracy, the public mattered, and there ought to be real efforts to engage the public. I think we would do well in the midst of a global pandemic to have that kind of creative thinking in Washington, D.C. today, and I'm not sure that we have it. The lessons I don't take is that the United States needs to return to some form of the order that it helped to construct in 1945. I think that order in its own time was provided a great benefit for many parts of the world. Let me say that. So I think that the problem is that the pursuit of American military dominance as a perpetual project has outlived its purposes ever since totalitarian conquerors disappeared from the earth as the Soviet Union collapsed decisively in 1991. The US military dominance had a particular rationale, and that was to contain the influence of totalitarian conquest. But it was very hard to stop the program of US dominance once the plausible specter of large-scale totalitarian conquest went away. And indeed, because U.S. primacy was conceived as something that might have to go on forever because the nature of international order was so brittle that it required an armed superpower to enforce it. It makes sense to me that the United States pursued global dominance, in fact, more complete than ever, after the fall of the Soviet Union. I think, though, that has led to a corruption of American strategy, which is to say the United States had outsized power and then has tried to search for purpose for it. And one of the results of that, unfortunately, has been strategic overextension, or to put it differently, endless war. And I think, so what I would invite people to consider is whether we need to, heed the call. It's been a call that's persisted for my whole adult lifetime. Let's go back to the good old days when American leadership was forged. The United States at that point, 1945, was producing half of global GDP. That's not the case anymore, facing a totally different landscape internationally. Let's go back and revive the great principles. Rather, I think the inheritance of 1945 today is part of our problem. And we should liberate ourselves. And if we want to take inspiration from post-war planners, we should take inspiration from the creative impulses that they brought to bear as they tried to grapple with what was appropriate for the specific nature of the world in which they were operating.
When you look today at the debate, especially within the Democratic Party, we saw that happening during the primaries. What do you think a Biden administration would do to maybe rebalance US engagement? Because we see still within the party different ways of looking at the role of the US. Biden himself, published an article during the campaign that was the US should lead or something like this for foreign affairs. It seems that the idea that as a true change hasn't really emerged in his mind, at least. But what do you say about the evolution within the party, and what do you expect to come from the next administration?
Well, it's a good question. As you say, the restorationist impulse is apparent from political rhetoric and the foreign affairs piece that you mentioned. Reportedly, President-elect Biden has been calling other leaders, or they've been calling him, and saying that America's back. At the same time, I think many in his circles recognize that times have changed. In the Democratic primary, I think it was an open question heading into it, what the tenor of the foreign policy debate would be. It might have focused on how Trump was retreating from the world militarily, recklessly, pulling troops out, supposedly. It might have focused on getting tougher with China or Russia or both or others. And there was a little bit of that. But the dominant frame for the debate was about ending endless war. And Biden showed that he understood that. He emphasized that there needed to be a real reassessment of the relationship with Saudi Arabia. He emphasized that he would break from the policy of the Obama administration and end US support for the Saudi coalition-led war in Yemen. He talked about how, even though he was reluctant to make criticisms of Obama policy, he also talked about how he was a voice in the room opposing the surge in Afghanistan, and said he wanted to end the forever war, although, what exactly that means remains unclear. So, it's hard to say how these conflicting forces will shake out over the course of the Biden administration. But I do think that we're not going to see something quite like, a third Obama term, right? A reversion to the status quo anti-Trump. It's partly because of what we've seen in the world in reaction to the presidency of Donald Trump, as well as the very real possibility that, Trump himself could win again. And frankly, nobody knows where the Republican Party is going. And we all have to assume that approximately half the time, there will be a Republican president and a Republican Congress. And approximately half the time, there will be a Democratic president or a Democratic Congress. So I think those domestic changes are going to factor significantly into the Biden administration's thinking. My hope is that there will be a continuation from the campaign of trying to listen to what the left wing of the Democratic Party is saying on foreign policy. And the other factor to throw in the mix, I think this is interesting, is that the future of conservative foreign policy is now rather up for grabs. Trump will be an ex-president. He had conflicting impulses on foreign policy. And I think neoconservatism clearly has been discredited at the grassroots of the party, as many Republicans in Congress understand. So on issues like the war in Yemen, we saw a left-right coalition to oppose U.S. intervention. During the Trump years, you might see that kind of coalition continue in some form in the Biden years as the right tries to make sense of what it wants on foreign policy.
Because this is the question, is what really makes the Biden administration different from the Obama one. I mean, looking at the debate in 2008, you could argue that there was already an impulse at the time to reconsider U.S. global leadership, or at least U.S. militarist action in the world, and somehow it did not exactly got implemented the way it was imagined. So there seems to be perhaps external forces that drag the US back into this position, or at least they are presented as such. So my question is, wouldn't you see the current debate on the US-China competition the next kind of pulling factor that will make the US again argue for global dominance?
That's right. So on the one hand, one big difference from 2021, when Joe Biden will take office, compared to 2009 when Barack Obama took office, is Obama had run on focusing in on the war on terror and going after the people responsible for 9/11, which meant doing more in Afghanistan, less in Iraq. Today, the war on terror, one of the, I think, under-noticed stories of the past 4 years, has been the fading of the war on terror as a threat in American, a perceived threat in American politics, or a perceived reality. It is now, more likely that there will be significant retrenchment by the United States in the Middle East. On the other hand, it is precisely the rise of China and the bipartisan U.S. concern with the trajectory of Chinese power that may offer a way of legitimating U.S. global supremacy by essentially presenting China as a crypto-totalitarian force in the mold of the Axis powers or Soviet-backed communism. And so I think that is a very real possibility that my book relates to directly, because it seems as though even if primacy is seen by elites as a kind of perpetual project, it seems as though the surest way to create public support for it has been to position the United States and its order, its free world order, against that of an actual adversary. However, if you look at what Joe Biden has said about China, he's made signals in different directions. And another international reality that we have to deal with is climate change. And climate change is precisely identified by most self-identified Democrats in the United States now as the #1 national security threat, outranking China, Russia, or any other nation state rival. And so I think, many around Biden are concerned about climate change, and the implications of climate change in the US-China relationship are quite profound, given that China is the leading emitter of greenhouse gases, and getting locked into a kind of Cold War framework with China that sends both countries fearing for their survival and elicits militarized responses, whether it's in the Indo-Pacific or beyond, is really good, I think, going to stifle any kind of meaningful cooperation on climate, which needed to happen yesterday and now needs to be accelerated. And that's something the Obama administration appreciated as well. So they will have to contend with these conflicting impulses, conflicting commitments that I think the policymakers directly, personally have, as well as impulses that are expressed by the Democratic base.
I want to take maybe one last question from the audience. I see one that asks how you would connect the militarist vision of the world order with the support for international organizations such as the UN or even later on the EU, and perhaps see if there could be a support for such organization without the militarist part.
I love that question. So the advocate in me says, yes, of course, there can be and should be support for a variety of international organizations if they're not, valued, or precisely because they shouldn't be valued as vehicles for the projection of American power. And I think it will be particularly interesting to see what the Biden position is towards greater strategic autonomy at the European level. My concern as an analyst, as a historian, is that often in the United States, support for international organizations and cooperation seems to rise or fall on whether it facilitates the projection of American power. In my view, that's why the UN was created. As the UN became less useful over time in undergirding American power, partly because of the Cold War stalemate, partly because of the introduction of decolonized nations, a significant segment of Americans turned against the UN. So, to me, in the 21st century, it makes sense that the United States should focus on the greatest threats, which to me are transnational and planetary. Pandemic disease, climate change have to be at the top of that list. To me, that warrants military retrenchment and diplomatic engagement, including through international organizations that are equipped for the purpose. So we'll have to see if that view wins out. But in fits and starts, it does seem to be getting expressed increasingly in American politics, as Americans left and right are concerned about the excessive militarization of the United States and are growing more attentive to the threats that they face where they live and work. And again, climate change, pandemic diseases are precisely those kinds of threats. The notion that China or Russia is going to attack the United States militarily in any direct sense is not.
As we're getting very close to the end, but as the German Marshall Fund, I can't help but ask a question about the transatlantic relationship and maybe end on this. So you explain in the book that the very idea of U.S. primacy comes from issues that stem from in Europe. And in a sense, the transatlantic relationship is at the core of the whole project in the 40s. When you discuss U.S. restraint or somehow reconsidering U.S. foreign policy today, there are some clear objectives in the Middle East, ending the forever war. So we can see what it means in the case of Afghanistan, Yemen, Iraq. What would it truly mean for U.S. commitment to European security, and perhaps because we're coming to an end, if we could close in 2 minutes.
Yeah, okay, so again, this remains to be seen. You're right, there's been a kind of coalition left and right on the Middle East, whereas it's only parts of the right voiced by President Trump in particular that have recently been questioning U.S. security commitments in Europe, even if that amounted to, in my opinion, a lot of rhetoric and very little by way of action. I do think that it's unavoidable if the United States seeks to play a smaller role in the world to take a reassessment of its alliances and partnerships across the board and ask what enhances U.S. security and what doesn't. And so, I personally think that even as, poll numbers show, I think largely in reaction to the kind of partisan polarization over President Trump, a lot of support for NATO. I would say that support is less deep than it might look among the American public, and that the Trump administration voiced concerns that are going to come back. I mean, have been a part of American presidents' complaints about burden sharing ever since the formation of NATO, and I think are going to be with us for quite some time, whether President Trump is still in the picture or not. And so, I am hopeful that at the very least, a Biden administration working in tandem with European partners will at least welcome efforts led by Europeans to seek autonomy and create a more multipolar order that the United States has often said that it supports, but has then insisted that everything be focused on US-led NATO.
Stephen, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us today, and thank you for your insight. Thank you all for participating in this discussion. We will continue our work as GMF on US foreign policy and on the transatlantic relationship with new book talks in the weeks to come. Have a good day, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.